In this lecture, we'll be discussing evolution. We'll start with the modern view of evolution, talk about natural selection, variations, and genetics. We'll move to discuss divergent, convergent evolution and extinctions. Then the last part is we'll look at evidence of evolution in fossils, classification of organisms, biological evidence, and examples of missing link fossils. So, how much do you know about evolution? Some people come to the class not knowing very much about evolution. Some people know a few things, but they don't really understand the big picture. Some people can explain it, and some people can even explain it and give examples for it. It doesn't matter where you are in this. I assume that you don't know anything about evolution. And also, there are a varying degree of opinions about evolution. Some people, they agree with it. Some people are kind of ambivalent to it. They're open to learn more. They don't have strong feelings either one way or the other. Some people don't agree with it. And some people are unsure. Feelings towards evolution. I've encountered, people that feel strongly both ways. But the thing is about evolution is it's something that you can observe. And so evolution is something that definitively exists. So it's not something you can agree with or disagree with, believe in or not believe in. It's an empirical fact that it happens. You see bacteria evolve. For example, you can shine ultraviolet light on bacteria and it'll kill most of the bacteria. You let a few bacteria will survive, and you allow them to repopulate, and then you hit them with ultraviolet light again. A lot of them will die again, but maybe a few more survive. To repeat that process, eventually more and more of the bacteria will survive. It's because they're evolving. They're evolving resistance or tolerance to the ultraviolet light. And we see that also with bacteria and their resistance to antibiotics. If you ever heard of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, that is bacteria that has evolved. And so evolution happens much more quickly. The faster the generational overturn is, the faster the reproduction rate. So with, say, viruses and bacteria, that's pretty quickly. That's pretty fast. And it's more slowly with other organisms. But it is something that is an empirical fact. It does happen. Right? And so, nonetheless, it is a hot topic for some people. It's just, somewhat regionally. So some parts of the country or world, they might have strong opinions one way or the other, shaped by different thoughts. But it is sometimes an issue. I think a lot of this stems from human evolution, because human evolution attempts to provide some answers to the question of where did we come from, and that's sometimes a sensitive issue for people. So I am cognizant of that. So I like to ask this question, class: of which of these statements is true? Evolution explains how life began. Evolutionists believe that humans descended from monkeys. There are no missing link fossils that are in between one type of animal and another. More than one of these statements is true, or all of these statements are false. Which one do you think is true? The correct answer is E. All of these statements are false. Evolution does not explain how life began. We currently do not know how life began on Earth. Science has no explanation for that as we speak. Evolution does not state that humans descended from monkeys. This is a little bit of semantics. It's apes, right? You might be asking yourself, well, what's the difference in monkey and ape? Well, there's a lot. But humans are one of the, we're part of the great ape family with gorillas and orangutans and chimpanzees and bonobos. They're very different. They're different from monkeys, right? So we are an ape, right? So we descend from the same line as other apes, other great apes. So there are no missing link fossils between one type of animal or another and another. That's false as well. Or we're going to look at several different missing link fossils. So all of these statements are false. Speaking of missing links, what is this? Right, this is an interesting skeleton. So this is an illustration of the skeleton of a fossil, a fossilized organism. So what does it look like to you? Kind of stands a little bit like a bird, right? It looks like a bird, but it also could be, it looks like a reptile, right? And so what is it? Is it a reptile? Is it a bird? Or is it a combination of a reptile and a bird? So we'll answer that question as we go on. Here's an actual artist's depiction of what this organism may have looked like. It's even more confusing because it has feathers like a bird, but it doesn't have a beak. It has a snout like a reptile. Its legs look like chicken legs, but it also has fingers like a reptile and like a bird. So what is that organism, right? It's confusing. It's hard to put it in a box. So we'll first start with the modern view of evolution. So the modern view of evolution basically has three pillars. So natural selection, mutations, and genetics. And all three of those are important to organic evolution. It's driven by natural selection. So we talk about natural selection, we first have to discuss artificial selection. So artificial selection is whenever organisms evolve, but due to humans deciding which traits are passed on or selected upon. So we select upon certain traits. Now, we commonly call artificial selection breeding when it comes to animals, like we breed dogs, we breed cats, we breed livestock. And we call it cultivation when it comes to plants. We cultivate different crops. For example, broccoli in the top left, cauliflower top right, kale bottom left, cabbage bottom right. They're all cultivated from wild mustard. They're all derivatives of wild mustard. They've been, by selecting certain traits in breeding plants or cultivating plants together that have those similar traits, those traits have been amplified over many generations and have brought about these different variants. Okay, so artificial selection is very powerful over enough generations. As you can see, for example, dogs. All dogs, modern domesticated dogs, they descend from a wild ancestor, a wolf-like wild dog. But you can see the variation in domesticated dogs, from the Great Dane to the Chihuahua, the Saint Bernard, to Shih Tzu. All right, and so that variation is all due to artificial selection. You have humans say, I see this dog that has this trait and big floppy ears. I want to accentuate that trait, so I find another dog that has those big floppy ears, and I have those two dogs mate, and then their offspring have big floppy ears, and maybe some of them have even bigger and floppier ears. Then I select upon those dogs. I breed those dogs with other dogs that have bigger and floppier ears. And so that accentuates that trait over time. So you can see the drastic change that can be brought about through artificial selection. Well, natural selection is whenever not humans are selecting on traits, but nature selects upon traits. So a trait is some characteristics that the organism has, and it can be many different types. It's everything from its appearance to its physiology, its anatomy. It's even at the genetic level. So the very traits are selected upon. And for example, you see 4 pictures of finches. Now, finches are famous because they're one of the species that were showcased in Darwin's argument for evolution driven by natural selection. Oops. Because Darwin, aboard the ship, the HMS Beagle, was traveling between the Galapagos Islands, which is an archipelago of islands produced by hotspot volcanism, off the west coast of South America. And he noticed that the finches on different islands had different shaped beaks. And then upon observing these finches, he realized that the difference in the beak shape was compatible or matched with the primary food source for the finch on that respective island. For example, the finches with the short, stout beaks, their primary food source was seeds and nuts. That they used their sturdy beak to crack open the seed or the shell of the seed or the nut and eat out the inside. Where the finch with the longer, more slender beak was picking insects out of tree stumps. And the finch with a curved and slender beak was eating nectar out of flowers. Right? And so he realized like there's one of either 2 things going on here. Either A, these finches just randomly have different shaped beaks, and they just happened to find a food source that their beak is amenable to. It's like, or they have the beaks that they have as a result of what food source is available on this island, what readily available food sources are available on this island. And so we know that the latter is the actual case, that the shape of the beak's finch is in response to the food source on the island. So the beak of the finch has adapted or evolved in order to take advantage of an abundant food source that maybe has, there's just maybe a lot of flowers, or maybe there's a lot of seeds, or maybe there's not a lot of competition with other organisms for that food source, or so forth. So it's observing finches among other organisms that helped Darwin crystallize this hypothesis of evolution driven by natural selection, where the environment, nature, selects upon features and amplifies and certain traits and causes organisms, or I should say populations of organisms, to change over many generations. All right, so the famous publication, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection by Charles Darwin. Interesting fact is that Sir Alfred Russel Wallace, another naturalist, he independently came up with this same hypothesis, evolution driven by natural selection. He was doing his studies in Indonesia. And as the story goes, his publication was actually submitted, or his manuscript was actually not published yet, was actually submitted to the Royal Academy of Sciences before Darwin's. But Darwin was more politically corrected, so he was able to have Sir Alfred Russel Wallace's manuscript slowed down in the review process so that Darwin's was published first. And so he gets all the credit. But, I feel like, it's every person's responsibility to kind of give a shout out to Sir Alfred Russel Wallace, because he has just as much credit as Darwin does. So natural selection. So everyone has heard the term survival of the fittest, right? And that is, in a very small nutshell, what natural selection is. But to be careful of what your idea of fit is, right? Because fit could mean a lot of different things. So what is survival of the fittest? Well, organisms in all populations, so populations is a group of organisms that are the same species. They possess heritable variations. Okay, variations or differences. And heritable means that those differences, those traits or characteristics are able to be passed on to the next generation. They can pass it on through heredity to their offspring. And those variations could be differences in size, speed, agility, visual acuity, digestive enzymes, color, and so forth. They could be any aspect of the organism. And some variations are far more favorable than others. That is to say that some variant types give the organism a competitive edge in either acquiring resources and or avoiding predators. And so it's those organisms that have those favorable variations or traits, they are the most likely to survive to reproductive maturity and therefore pass on the genes for those favorable traits. Whereas organisms with variants that are not beneficial, that are actually put the organism at a disadvantage, it's harder to find food. It's harder to avoid predators. They are less likely to survive to reproductive maturity and reproduce. Therefore, those genes are passed on to the next generation, either not at all or at a much smaller rate. And so the favorable variation or trait allowing for the organism to reach reproductive maturity is nature selecting upon that trait, and then that trait being passed on to the next generation. Because remember, when it comes to living organisms, biological success is passing on your genes to the next generation. Everything else is superfluous, right? That is what biological success is passing on your genes to the next generation. So what it means to be fit is different for different organisms. So for example, for the opossum, top left, fit is having a prehensile tail and being able to hang by your tail. For a giraffe, it's having a long neck, so you're able to reach leaves in the canopy that other grazers, sorry, not grazers, other browsers cannot reach, so you have less competition for food. For hippopotamus, it's having aquatic features, amphibious features where you can move both in land and water with relative ease. And for the cheetah, you can say, it's its speed, its acceleration, more like its acceleration, and its spots for camouflage. And maybe for the mouse, it's keen hearing and other features. But fit is not necessarily the same for all organisms. It depends on what niche, which is what ecological role that organism is playing in the ecology or in the community that organism is living in. So these variations, these traits that are different among organisms that nature selects upon, right, which give either an organism a competitive advantage or a disadvantage, they arise via mutations. Now, mutations are whenever there is a change in the genetic makeup, the genetic information, so in the chromosomes or the genes, during the reproductive process. And so this means that whenever the genes, the chromosomes and genes are passed on from the parents to the next generation, it's not a direct duplicate. There are some augmentations to the genetic information. And so this mutation brings about a feature or a trait in the offspring that is not possessed by the parents. That's what makes it a mutation. Now, this isn't to be confused with a, say, like a regressive gene. So, for example, your parents could both have brown eyes, but they can have a blue-eyed child. And say, well, that was a mutation, right? Neither parent had brown eyes, but the child has blue eyes. No, it's because the gene that for blue eyes is what's called a recessive gene. Sorry, I couldn't think of a word there. Which means if another gene is present, like the gene for brown eyes, it dominates over it. So if one parent passes on, if just one parent passes on a dominant gene, say a gene for brown eyes, that child will have brown eyes. But if both parents pass on the recessive gene for blue eyes, then and only then will the child have blue eyes. So that's how you can have a child that has blue eyes whose parents have brown eyes. But the thing is, their ancestors had to have had blue eyes. So that gene is in the gene pool, right? It's not a mutation, it's just the recessive gene, and it's just being expressed because it's not being overtaken by a dominant gene. So that's a important difference between a mutation and the expression of a recessive gene. So mutations are random with respect to fitness. So whenever these changes occur to the genetic information that determines all the certain features of organism, these changes, these mutations, they are completely random with respect to how they benefit the organism in its environment. So they could be beneficial, helpful to the organism, they could be neutral, have no impact on the organism at all, or they could be harmful, put the organism at a disadvantage. And so it's those mutations that are beneficial that are strongly selected upon, and those that are harmful that are selected against by nature. So let's look at an example. Let's say tulips. So let's say up until this point in time, the only pigmentation that the petals of tulips have is red. There's only ever been red tulips. Now, tulips depend on pollinators for reproduction, right? They need bees to visit them to gather nectar, but as a consequence, they gather pollen, and then as the bee visits another tulip, that pollen is transported from one flower to another, and so they're able to reproduce. And so, what is selecting upon these tulips and determining whether they reproduce or not is the bees, or whatever the pollinator is. I'm just going to say it's bees. There could be multiple different pollinators. I'm just going to say it's bees in this case. So let's say that somewhere along the line, two tulips reproduce, and in that reproduction, there's a mutation. There's a mutation to the gene that determines what pigment or what coloration the petals of the flower has. And that mutation results in the petals not being red, but yellow. And so all of a sudden, spring comes, all the tulips, they sprout and they grow and they bloom, and here we go, we have this yellow tulip. Now, one of three things can happen. The bees could either A, see that actually not be able to tell the difference between the yellow and the red tulip. What would happen in that scenario? Well, the bees are no more or less likely to visit that yellow tulip than the red tulips. So what happens is that yellow tulip will be visited just as much as any other red tulip. And so the next spring, there will be a couple more yellow tulips. And the next spring, there'll be more yellow tulips. And the next spring, more. And then several generations later, it'll be 50-50, roughly 50-50, because there's no preference, right? Each yellow tulip is visited just as much as each red. So the reds aren't selected against, Yellows aren't selected against, it's neutral. So now we find both variants in the population, yellow and red. That's one scenario. That's a neutral variant. Mutation that brings about a variant that's harmful. Let's say the bees see yellow and it is very, very offensive to the bees. They want nothing to do with that yellow tulip. That means that no bees visit that yellow tulip. And so unfortunately for that tulip, its pollen does not get transferred to any other tulips. And so it does not reproduce. And so the next spring, there's no yellow tulips. Right? So we go selected against. Then the third option is maybe the bees are extremely attracted to the yellow tulip. And so many, many bees visit that yellow tulip. So yellow tulip actually, because it's visited by bees at a higher rate than the red tulips, it's going to reproduce at a higher rate than the red tulips. And so next spring, you're going to see a lot more yellow tulips. In the spring after that, even more. And eventually, many generations down the line, because the yellow is favorable, it will outcompete the red, and there will be no more red tulips. Red tulips will no longer exist. Yellow tulips will be the new tulip, right? So that would be a beneficial trait. So neutral, it's 50-50. Beneficial, it takes over. And if it's harmful, it gets squashed out, the mutation. And another example of mutation is albinoism, like this albino lion, where it doesn't produce any melanin to give it color. So it has white skin, white hair. And albinoism in lions is not a favorable trait. It's not a favorable mutation for one reason or another. Maybe the lionesses want nothing to do with albino males, and so they cannot find a pride, and they're forced to fend for themselves, hunt for themselves, and it's really hard to ambush prey whenever you're white, right? You stick out very clearly. So that's why every time this mutation arises, it quickly gets squashed out because it's not beneficial. And so whenever a new variation does arrive through a mutation, it's important that if it's beneficial, how does it get passed on? It gets passed on through genetics. And so the genetic information that an organism passes on to the next generation is predetermined to a very large extent, which means that there's nothing that can happen to an organism during its lifetime that can change what genes it'll pass on to the next generation, except if the genes are actually damaged, right, by radiation or some sort of chemical toxins. Now that can actually cause then problems with reproduction because the genetic information is actually just damaged. But whenever organisms they reproduce, they have a certain gene pool that they pull from. It's their gene pool that their reproductive cells, their sperm and their eggs, pass on. And so that's not changed by anything the organism does during its life. So for example, in this cartoon, you see the very ripped baby in the maternity ward. Because all I can say is my wife worked out every day when she was pregnant. No. That doesn't happen. The same way if you get a tattoo, your child's not going to be born with a tattoo. If you're an amputee, your child's not going to be born an amputee. Even if you're blind, for a reason that's not genetic, if you go blind, there's no reason to think that your child would be blind. But if it is genetic, it could be passed on. So that is not how it works. So this selection upon favorable mutations and amplification of those variations over many generations can eventually lead to enough change in a group of organisms that they become sufficiently different enough from other groups of the same species that are no longer recognizable as the same species. And this process is called speciation. And this is actually where the title of Darwin's manuscript on the origin of species comes from, because this natural selection, organic evolution driven by natural selection was the mechanism that he proposed for the generation of new species. Eventually, organisms evolved to the point where they're genetically different enough from other organisms of the same ancestral population that they're no longer genetically recognizable as the same species. An example of this is these warblers in Asia. So we see a single ancestral species of these greenish warblers is thought to have originated on the southern edge of the Himalayas about 10,000 years ago. Okay, so right here, these warblers. And over the years, the warblers established new populations on both sides of the treeless Tibetan Plateau. Now, the fact that the Tibetan Plateau is treeless is important because the warblers could not cross over the Tibetan Plateau because there was no habitat for them. So the warblers on the east of the plateau and the warblers on the west of the plateau were not able to interbreed, so that their gene pools could not mix. And so the birds that were still in the southern part of the Himalayas, they were still able to interbreed and maintain the same species. By the time that the warblers migrated many generations later around the Tibetan Plateau, and they came back in contact with each other in Siberia, north of the Tibetan Plateau, the warblers from the east of the plateau and the warblers from the west of the plateau, they did not interbreed, unlike the ones to the south of the plateau. They didn't recognize each other's songs, their wing coloration, and their genes were different. So the warblers appear to have become two separate species. So this is an example of speciation. So formation of new species from organic evolution. Now this is how, if you think how plate tectonics comes into effect, you imagine an ancestral population of organisms living on a continent, and that continent now rifts apart. Half of the population goes with one continent, half goes with another continent. Now, as those continents move to different latitudes and have different climates, different environments, nature is going to select upon them differently. And so natural selection is going to drive their evolution in different directions. And so eventually they'll become different species. So this brings us to divergent and convergent evolution. So we were just discussing the speciation. That's an example. That's the result of divergent evolution. So divergent evolution is whenever you have organisms that begin closely related and similar, but they end after evolution still closely related but different. Now I want to take this second right now to define what I mean by closely related, okay, evolutionarily speaking. So the degree to which two species are related is how far they are removed from a common ancestor. So let me ask you this question. Who is your closest relative right now? You know, who are you most closely related to? A lot of people might say your parents. But that depends. If you are our only child, that is correct. But if you have a sibling that hails from the same two parents, they are your closest relative because they share more of the same gene pool as you. Unlike your parents, where each of your parents only share half of your gene pool, right? Because you have genes from your other parent that say you have genes from your father and your mother. Your mother does not share the genes that you have from your father, and your father does not share the genes with you that you have from your mother. But your sibling has those genes. That's the same gene pool. And so So you're most closely related to your siblings. Now we're looking at the same generation because the current generation on Earth are all species that are alive right now. And so your parents is the first generation backward in time, then your grandparents is the next, great grandparents, and so forth. So after your siblings, who is the next closest relative of your same generation? Well, that would be your first cousins, because you share with them a common ancestor, that is a pair of grandparents. And then after your first cousins, it's your second cousins, because you share a common relative that is great grandparents. And so the degree of relation between two species is how far back you have to go until you find a common ancestor. The further you have to go back in the lineage until you find that common ancestor, the more distantly related the species are. And the more recent that common ancestor is, the more closely those species are. Okay, so divergent evolution means we have two species that are closely related. That means they share a very recent common ancestor. And that usually means that they're very similar to each other. They look similar to each other, right? You would say how a black bear looks very similar to a brown bear because they are two different species, but they share a fairly recent common ancestor, some ancestral bear that both of those species evolved from. Well, divergent evolution means they evolve in different ways. So natural selection drives their evolution in different ways. So by the end, they're still closely related because you cannot change the degree to which you're related to your siblings or cousins. But over time, many generations, because they evolve differently, they've changed. Now, I like to use this analogy with siblings and cousins the same way. So let's say, you have a sibling, and your sibling moves to one part of the country or one part of the world that has a certain culture, and you move to a different part of the world that has a different culture. Now, because you live in those cultures, eventually, because we're social organisms, we acquiesce to that culture. And so you're still the degree of relation is still the same. You're still siblings, but because you're in different cultures, you become different. So if you ever come in contact with each other again, you might have different viewpoints on the world, different beliefs, because you have diverged from living in different cultures. Example, and that's an analogy for divergent evolution. On the other hand, convergent evolution is you have two species that are not closely related, and as a result, they're different. But because they live in a similar environment and nature selects upon them in similar ways, they become more and more similar. They do not become more related. You cannot change the degree of relation, but you can change their features. They become more and more similar. So take the same analogy. There could be someone from the other side of the world that you are not close related to at all, and you both move to the same city. So you're both in the same culture. And so over time, as you both acquiesce to that culture, you might meet each other and find out that you have a lot in common. You're friends, you share a lot of the same viewpoints, right? So you're similar. You were different, right? Whenever you lived in different parts of the world and there's different cultures, but now that you lived in the same culture for some time, you become more similar. You're still not any closely related. You're still distantly related, but you're more similar from living in that same similar culture for longer. So if two species that are not closely related live in the same ecosystem, same environment, and filling a similar niche in that ecosystem for a long enough time, they'll become more and more similar. So let's look at some examples of divergent evolution. So the finches, that is a hallmark example of divergent evolution. So the finches of the Galapagos all hail from some ancestral species of finch that came from the mainland of South America. that begin to populate the Galapagos Islands. Then as these populations of finches, got a foothold on each island, the food source on that island drove the evolution of the beak in different directions. And so they diverged from the ancestral beak that the ancestral bird had to the each respective island. So that's an example of divergent evolution. So, for example, mammals. If you look at all the mammals on the planet, there has been a lot of divergent evolution. So the first mammals were these little tiny insectivore mammals. So very, basically rodents. Think of like a shrew or a mole. Right? And from them, all these different groups of mammals have diverged from living in different environments and being selected upon differently. So you have flying mammals, you have tree-dwelling mammals, you have predatory mammals, you have marine mammals, you have all these different types of mammals that have diverged from a common ancestor. So they're still close related, they're still all mammals, but they're very different, right? Very different because of that divergent evolution. And we can see examples of this divergent evolution in vertebrates, right? Because vertebrates all evolved from an ancestral vertebrate. Okay, ancestral vertebrate, and we have diverged from that ancestor that we all share. So, for example, if you look at the forelimbs of humans, on the left, horse, cat, bat, bird, whale, see, we all have the same bones that are articulated in the same manner. We all have the humerus, we all have the forearm bones, the ulna and radius, we all have wrist bones, hand bones, and finger bones. Right? All the same bones, but they have been modified, right? Some of them have lost digits, right? Say a horse only has one finger, right? A bat fingers, the digits are extended to be able to support skin that creates the wing. Where the whale, the digits have extended to form a flipper, and the other bones have shortened. But they're all the same bones because these are the bones that were inherited from their common ancestor, but they've been modified and adapted to different environments because natural selection has caused them to diverge, change from their common ancestral structure, or I guess configuration. So now we'll look at some examples of convergent evolution. So where organisms begin not related and different, and they end not related but similar. So for example, we can look at mammals again. We looked at them as an example of divergent evolution. We can also look at them as an example of convergent evolution if you look at two different groups of mammals. So as we'll learn later, there's three main groups of mammals: the monotremes, egg-laying mammals, the marsupials, the pouched mammals, and the placentals, those that give birth to fully developed live young. Well, so all the placentals have evolved from a common ancestral placental mammal. All the marsupials from a common ancestral marsupial, and so forth. And so we have placental mammals that look very similar to marsupial mammals. For example, this wolf looks similar to the Tasmanian wolf, which is now extinct, a thylacine, that lived in Tasmania. This ocelot, a placental, looks very similar to this native cat. It's a marsupial. The groundhog placental looks very similar to a wombat. Now, why do these organisms look similar? Because they live in a similar environment and fill a similar niche. For example, the groundhog and the wombat are both burrowing mammals, right? But the interesting thing is that this mouse is more closely related to this wolf than it is to the marsupial mouse, because it shares a more recent common ancestor with the wolf, the ancestral placental mammal they both evolved from. So because they look similar, say this mouse and the marsupial mouse, does not mean they are closely related. As I said, the mouse, the placental mouse is more closely related to the wolf. They look similar because they live in similar environments. Nature has selected upon them in a similar way, right? So this mouse is more closely related to the thylacine than it is the placental mouse. So this is an example of convergent evolution, right? They look similar because they live in similar environments. They're not as closely related as they are to other organisms, mammals that look different from them. And why they look different, why does the mouse look different from the wolf? Well, that's divergent evolution. They look similar to organisms that are more distantly related to because of convergent evolution. Okay, so here's some colored images of these marsupials and placentals that look similar due to convergent evolution. So what type of evolution are whales an example of? Divergent evolution, convergent evolution, or it depends on what you're comparing them to? Well, just like any organism, it depends on what you're comparing them to, right? Just like with the placental mouse, it's an example of convergent evolution when you compare it to the marsupial mouse, but it's an example of divergent evolution when you compare it to the wolf. And whales the same. So these animals are all closely related are all closely related. What are they examples of? Well, they're all closely related, but they look different, right? So they must be an example of divergent evolution. These animals are distantly related. A whale is a mammal, right? Where it's a warm-blooded, gives birth to live young, has mammary glands. Where a great white shark is a fish. It's cold-blooded. Doesn't even have it has a cartilage skeleton. Doesn't have mammary glands. It doesn't have lungs. It has gills. So they're very distant related, but they look similar, right? They look similar. Well, because they're distant and related, but they look similar because they live in the same environment, marine environment, they are an example of convergent. These animals all swim or swam in the ocean. What type of evolution are they examples of? So a swordfish is a fish, ichthyosaur is an extinct reptile, and a dolphin is a mammal. Because they are distant related, but they look similar, they are examples of convergent evolution. Because their environment has selected upon them in similar ways and have produced similar body types. So whales are an awesome example of evolution. So whales' ancestors are terrestrial mammals because the earliest mammals were terrestrial mammals or little insectivore mammals, like little rodents. And so whales are obviously marine mammals now, so they must have diverged from those ancestral terrestrial mammals. So about 55 million years ago, whales and hippos shared a common ancestor. Now, obviously, this mammal was living on land. It was terrestrial, means it lives on land, but it must have been living near water. So maybe near the mouth of a river, where a river was opening up to the ocean. So this mammal that lived on land, these mammals, they started going into the water for one reason or another. Maybe they're going into the water to find food, fish, or whatever. Maybe they're going into the water to avoid predators on land. Whatever the reason was, they're going into the water. Some of those mammals, they would come out of the water and then go back into the water. And so, but they never really fully committed one lifestyle. They kind of wanted to split their time between land and water. Whatever was going on, they found it advantageous to be able to move on land, function on land, and move in water, function in water. And so those mammals would be the ancestors of the hippopotamus, which is more amphibious, right? It can move between land and water. Where another group of those mammals, they spent more of their time in water. And so natural selection selected upon variations that would arise from mutations that were beneficial for living in water. And it would select against the terrestrial traits that it had. And so over time, the terrestrial traits were selected against, and the marine traits that arise through mutations were selected upon. And slowly, after many generations, 55 million years, the organism now, the descendants, are marine mammals, and they cannot function on land at all. They're fully adapted to life in the water. The interesting thing is, as you can see this, you think about a fish. How does a fish swim? Well, a fish's tail, a fish, unless it's a flatfish, it's still different, but it still evolved from the ancestors like this. Fish are more, they have, they're kind of flat. Their eyes are on both sides, one eye on each side, and they're kind of flat. And their tail, their swim flaps back and forth, right? Side to side, just like a shark, right? When it swims, its tail goes back and forth this way. If you notice, a marine mammal, its tail, whenever it swims, goes different. It goes up and down. You also notice marine reptiles, like a crocodile. How does it swim? It kicks its tail side to side, right? So you can see how the tail fin of the ichthyosaur reptile is designed for its tail to move side to side. And so fish's vertebrae are designed to be more flexible side to side than up and down. You really don't see a fish flexing up and down too much. It's more side to side. Same thing with a reptile. Imagine a crocodile walking, right? It's low to the ground, its belly's almost dragging on the ground, and its vertebrae is oscillating side to side. Where mammals are more well adapted to land, and so their limbs evolved to be longer and more underneath their body to give more distance between the ground and their bodies, and their backbones or spines evolved to flex up and down to be to lend to more efficient locomotion or movement on land. Whenever mammals evolved back into the water, or a group of mammals, that is the marine mammals, their spines are still more flexible up and down instead of side to side. That's why the fluke of marine mammals is horizontal and not vertical, because of their spinal structure, which they inherited from mammals like us. Like, you can bend over and touch your toes much more easily than you can bend over to the side or the other side. So, looking at some ancestors of whales, this is Pakicetus. This is the skeleton of Pakicetus. Here's an artist's illustration of Pakicetus here. So you can clearly see this is a terrestrial mammal, right? It looks like it has 4 limbs and hind limbs. They're positioned underneath the body. The 4 limbs are connected to shoulders, which are connected to the spine. Hind limbs to hips, which is connected to the spine. And so this organism is structured. The skeletal structure is designed so that it's supporting its weight against gravity on land, and it's designed to move on land. Ambulocetus is another ancestor of modern-day whales. and it's a descendant of Pakicetus. You can see how Ambulocetus, excuse me, is a little bit more adapted for aquatic life and not so much for terrestrial life. For example, look at its forelimbs. Its forelimbs are not as long relative to its rib cage. So if it tried to walk on land, it would pretty much have to be dragging its chest on the ground, right? Why does it have such a large rib cage? Well, it's a mammal, so it has lungs, so it has to breathe air. And if you're going underneath water, you need to take a large breath so you don't have to surface as often. So you need a larger lung capacity, therefore larger rib cage. Has longer digits to support webbing to create more efficient swimming. And you can see its skull has become larger. One of the reasons is now you don't have to support the weight of such a bulky skull because the buoyant force of water helps support its weight. And also, now that you're in water hunting prey, your prey can potentially move in 3 dimensions throughout the water, where on land it can only move in 2 dimensions across the surface of the ground. And so it might be easier to catch the prey with the larger jaw. And you can also see that it's overall became bigger. It's more easily, some scientists hypothesize that it's more efficient for containing body heat to have a larger surface area to volume ratio to change. Being large, the surface area to volume ratio is more beneficial to conserving body heat. And also you don't have to support the weight. You don't have to support the weight of being on land, so you can be larger. And you can see that the vertebrae are larger because there's probably the general rule of thumb is the larger the bone, the larger the muscles attached to the bone. Because if you think a strong muscles pull on bones, they move bones. And so if you're going to have a strong muscle that can exert a lot of force, you have to have a strong bone that can handle that force. So the larger and thicker the bones, the stronger the muscles attached to them. So these larger vertebrae are suggesting larger, stronger bones that now this organism is now using its body, its tail, everything to help propel itself through water. You can also see it in the nostrils. So Pakicetus 50 million years ago, its nostrils, like most terrestrial mammals, are at the end of the snout. And one of the reasons why is because whenever air enters the lungs, in order to effectively remove the oxygen from the air has to be 100% humidified. It has to be very humid. And so having breathing the air through a long nasal cavity helps humidify the air whenever you're living on dry land. It also helps you smell the air better because have a better sense of smell because you breathe it through this olfactory chamber that's longer, has more olfactory receptors that can smell more effectively. So like a dog, the longer the snout, the better the sense of smell. Right, where 25 million years ago, a descendant of Pakicetus and a more recent ancestor of whales, the nostril is no longer at the end of the snout, it's at the middle of the skull. And then in modern day whales, the nostrils are at the top of the skull. The reason for this migration is there's no need for the nostril to be at the end of the snout. Actually, that's a problem because it makes taking a breath more cumbersome. Where having a nostril at the top of the skull allows the organism just to skim the surface and just put the top of the skull out of the water, exhale, that's the blowhole, it just taking exhale and it breathes in through that nostril and then goes back underneath water. It doesn't have to worry about humidifying the air because it's breathing air that's literally right above the ocean. It's very humid. And it's not smelling anything because it's living under the water. It's just not smelling. So the nostrils of whales' ancestors migrated from the end of the snout to the top of the head in order to better suit the new aquatic environment. Now, remember, life is very efficient. So whenever it comes to life and death, details matter. So if you're a whale and you're trying to avoid a predator, let's say it's a shark, it's a fish, it doesn't have to surface for air. So you're at a disadvantage. So because you have to surface for air and it doesn't, that's something that you're required to do that the shark isn't. And so what if it's a cumbersome act of taking a breath, it's going to slow you down. And if it slows you down, there's a chance that you might get caught by that predator and you will die, right? And you won't reproduce, pass on those genes. But if your nostril is positioned where you can take a more streamlined breath, it takes less time to take that breath and keep on moving, then you have a better odds of either A, avoiding a predator, or let's say you're a predator yourself and your prey is a fish, it doesn't have to breathe. Well, the less time it takes for you to breathe, the more chances there are for you to catch the fish. And, I like to use the analogy in this situation of an Olympic swimmer, right? Their form is extremely important, right? They practice their form for hours on end because they're gliding through the water. If their form is a little bit off, it's going to create a little additional drag between their body and the water that's going to slow them down just a little bit, milliseconds. And they don't take a breath every stroke, right? Because each time I take a breath, that creates a little bit extra drag and it slows them down a little bit. So they make sure that every stroke is very smooth and choreographed and streamlined as best as possible. And every breath is the same because milliseconds matter at that high level of competition. And so if your strokes are not as smooth and they create more drag in the water, you're not going to move through the water as fast, you're going to lose the race. Now that's just at the Olympics. Whenever the race is a life and death matter, whether you find food and can survive, or if you can avoid being food and survive, nature selects upon the most efficient, the most beneficial variations. So we go from Ambulocetus, which was an ancestor whales, a descendant of Ambulocetus, and a more recent ancestor of whales is the Basilosaurus, which is a group of marine mammals. You can see they still have the teeth of their ancestral terrestrial mammals. Their nostrils are not at the top of their skull. The nostrils are kind of more in the middle. And you can see they also have these hind limbs that are little flippers. Those are pointed out. And they have these little tiny hip bones in which their hind limbs are attached to. And then Durodon, a descendant of Basilosaurus, a more recent ancestor of whales. You can see how it has these little tiny hip bones and hind limbs. So it's a little bit, it has less of those terrestrial features from its ancestors, and it's even more marine. So modern day whales just have these little tiny hip bones, And those hip bones are inherited from their terrestrial ancestors. Now they have no use for them, and over the generations, their hind limbs have completely disappeared, and you can see those hip bones are on the way of disappearing themselves too. But they're still there, right? They're still there. And so, we see this in embryology, how as the fetus of the whale develops, it starts off as all the other terrestrial mammals, right? It starts off with hips and hind limbs, but then genes turn on during its development that causes those hind limbs to dissolve and the hips to dissolve away, but they don't completely dissolve away yet. There's still little tiny hip bones that remain. So several million years down the line, those hip bones could completely disappear. Now, extinctions. So new species arise on the planet through speciation, so divergent evolution. And species leave the planet through extinction. Now, extinction sounds like a very negative idea, that the species completely disappears from the face of the planet. But the the truth of the matter is extinction is the status quo. Just like death is an inevitable fact of life, every organism must die, so is extinction. Every species goes extinct. Over 99% of all species that have ever existed on this planet are extinct, which makes sense, right? Because there's been a large number of species that have been on this planet that are now no longer here today, so they're extinct. And extinctions are occurring all the time. There's background, we call them background extinctions, are continuously taking place. Species are always going extinct. At the same time, new species are coming into existence through speciation. However, there are these periods of time known as mass extinctions, where the rate of extinction is accelerated. So a very large number of species are going extinct at the relatively the same time. And as a result, the Earth loses a significant amount of its biologic diversity in a relatively short period of time. Now, these mass extinctions have occurred several times in Earth's history, and they're actually the events that form the basis of the geologic timescale. For example, the end of the Paleozoic era is a mass extinction called the Permian-Triassic mass extinction. The Permian is the last period of Paleozoic. The Triassic is the first period of the Mesozoic. The Mesozoic ends with a mass extinction. That's right. It's called the KT mass extinction because it marks the end of the Cretaceous, last period of the Mesozoic, beginning of the Tertiary, first period of the Cenozoic. Right. So mass extinctions act as the framework of the geologic timescale, which makes sense because fossils were a huge means of relative dating and putting things in order in geologic time prior to absolute dating. Right, so there's been 5 mass extinctions in Earth's history, and we are currently in the 6th. Okay, we're currently in the 6th. There's been 5, we're currently in the 6th. So here we can see this starts at the end of the Precambrian. So this is the beginning of the Paleozoic, about 545 million years ago, and it goes to present day. And this is basically diversity is the number of known genera. So this is, you can think of biodiversity. So we have the Cambrian, which complex animal life begins to evolve and take off. We have a drop off there, we have a drop off there, and then we have this large drop off. Okay, this is a large mass extinction known as the Permian-Triassic mass extinction, and it marks the end of the Paleozoic, the beginning of the Mesozoic. So diversity, speciation, evolution and speciation brings out new species. So there's diversification, drops off, mass extinction event. Then this large one right here, boom. That large extinction event, the Cretaceous Tertiary, KT extinction event, marks the end of the Mesozoic. You see species, it diversifies on after that. Right, you say, well, this is a really accelerated rate of speciation, right? Unlike prior. Well, keep in mind, these are more recent, so we just have more record, right? Where there could be organisms from back here that we just have not found fossils of them yet, so we don't even know they existed. And so, you have to take this with a grain of salt. The record, as you go further back, it's less and less robust. And so we could have had speciation rates or increases in diversity that were maybe parallel to that in the past, but we just don't see it because the fossil record isn't as extensive or complete. And then down here on this plot, down here, this is the extinction rate as the percentage of known genre. And so where this is low, it means there's a low extinction rate. And these spikes represent high extinction rates. And so these are mass extinctions, these spikes. So here's the Permian-Triassic, and here's the KT mass extinction. So there's been, some notable extinction events in Earth's history. All right. So now we're going to look at evidence of evolution. We're going to look at this in fossils, classification of organisms, biological evidence, and examples of missing link fossils. on this slide, we see which is a very broad, what we call a cladogram, which we'll talk about more detail later. Cladogram, cladogram, potato, potato. It's pronounced both ways. But you can see this is the Phanerozoic eon. So this is everything from the after the Precambrian to today. So the Phanerozoic includes the Paleozoic era, the Mesozoic era, and the Cenozoic era. You can see we see these different vertebrates. So this is vertebrate cladogram. We see jawless fish, then jawed fishes, cartilaginous fishes branch off, then bony fishes branch off, and then amphibians evolve, reptiles evolve, then off of reptiles, birds evolve, and then mammals branch off, mammals evolve. So we can see when different vertebrate groups evolved. For example, bony fishes evolved during the Silurian. Amphibians evolved, they appeared the late Devonian. Reptiles in the Pennsylvanian. Birds in the Jurassic. And mammals back in the Pennsylvanian. So how do we know this? How can we put this together? Well, we use the fossil record. We use the fossil record to put these, you can kind of look at these cladograms as these family trees of organisms. So fossils, and what we can learn from them. So fossils are the remains or traces of ancient organisms that are preserved in rocks and sediments. There's two types of fossils, body fossils and trace fossils. Body fossils, they include shells, bones, teeth, and then much more rarely, either frozen or mummified remains. I'm sure you've heard of like frozen mammoths or dogs found in the tundra of Siberia. Those are technically fossils. Even though they're not, not all fossils are rock, but either way, or even insects trapped in amber. They even found tails of dinosaurs, feathery tails of dinosaurs trapped in amber, which is fossilized resin from trees or sap from trees. Those are all considered to be body fossils. So they're preservations of the actual bodies, parts of the bodies of the organism. Trace fossils, on the other hand, are fossilized evidence of the traces the organism left behind. So the burrows that they lived in, fossilized, or footprints that they left behind are fossilized. So those are examples of trace fossils. So when it comes to body fossils, hard body parts, especially shells of marine organisms, which are made out of inorganic matter, calcium carbonate, and sometimes silica and other materials, they are far more likely to be preserved because they don't decay as fast as fossils than soft body organisms, organisms that don't have any hard tissue like jellyfish or worms. Large terrestrial vertebrates, they have calcified bones, so hard structures, but even that bone, it will eventually decay away if it's not preserved in the correct manner. And so part of that is it has to be buried very rapidly. And so for terrestrial vertebrates like dinosaurs, mammals, other reptiles or birds, to be fossilized, they have to be buried rapidly. And not only that, other conditions will be present, which is very unlikely. Right? So we don't find as many fossils of terrestrial organisms as we do marine organisms, especially marine organisms with hard inorganic shells. Those are the most fossils we find, the most abundant fossils we find. So what do we learn from fossils? So fossils, they provide a record that is evidence of evolution, because looking at the fossil record, we can see gradual change, and we can put these organisms in these trees and we can see what organism is related to what. So, because looking at the skeleton of different organisms, you can see, well, they both have this bone located at this location, has these proportions, and serving this purpose, right? And so you can group them together and put together these ancestral trees. So for example, the tapir, the rhinoceros, and the horse, you can see they all share a common ancestor. But the tapir and the rhinoceros are more closely related to each other because the fossil record suggests that they have a more recent common ancestor than they do with horses. And so we see a sequence of different groups of organisms appearing throughout geologic time. And we can see those ancestral features inherited from one generation to the next through geologic time through the fossil record. Allows us to reconstruct these cladograms. So for example, when we find fossils of whales' ancestors, some of them the snout was right here. Some of them the snout was right here. Right here, right here. We see that gradual move in the fossil record as time progresses. So we see gradual evolution. Other evidence of evolution exists in biological classification. Now, the natural system of classification, which was developed by Carlos Linnaeus, it basically is grouping organisms or classifying organisms based upon similar features. Okay, and it's a hierarchical classification where you have these different hierarchies or different levels. And the higher the level, the more general the features of that classification. And the lower the level, the more specific. So it goes kingdom, phylum, subphylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So with this system of classification, a species is defined by its genus and its species. So the genus is the group it belongs to, and the species is the specific group of organisms from that group. So here we have an example. This is the natural classification of a coyote. So a coyote is in kingdom Animalia, which is all animals, multicellular organisms. They have cells with a nucleus. They reproduce sexually, and they ingest preformed organic molecules. In other words, they eat food. They're not, photosynthetic. They have to eat food. They're in the phylum Chordata, which means they are all considered in the kingdom Animalia. They're all animals that possess a notochord, basically a spinal cord. They're in the subphylum Vertebrata, so they're all chordates, all animals that have a spinal cord that's surrounded by vertebrae. So they have an actual vertebrae, so they have a spine, okay, the actual skeletal spine. They're in the class Mammalia, which is all vertebrates that are warm-blooded with hair or fur and mammary glands. Then they're in the order Carnivora, which is all mammals that have teeth specialized for a diet of meat. And they're in the family Canidae, which is all carnivores, dog-like carnivores, including domestic dogs, wolves, coyotes, and foxes. They're in the genus Canis, made up of only related species, domestic dogs, wolves, and coyotes. And they're in the species Latrans, which is all those organisms of, all those consist of all similar individuals that in nature can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So the classic biological definition of a species is a group of similar individuals that can reproduce, and have viable offspring, fertile offspring, which means that their offspring can reproduce, have offspring themselves. Now, organisms from two different species, it is possible for them to reproduce. For example, you take a horse and an ass. If you breed a horse and an ass together, you get a mule. A mule is a hybrid. It's parents are two different species. So it itself is not fertile. It's not viable. It cannot reproduce. Another example, have you ever heard of things like a liger, a tiger, and a lion, or a whale fin, a whale, and a shark? Oh, sorry, well, a shark, that can't happen. A whale and a dolphin. Now, obviously, this usually takes place in captivity, not in the wild, but they can reproduce, but their offspring are not viable. Now, there are some observations in nature where this classical definition of a species breaks down. So it's been observed where some species of coyote and wolves have interbred and produced fertile offspring. So they, they're two different species, the wolves and the coyote, but the fact that they're able to successfully interbreed and have viable offspring kind of, it shows that classical definition of a species that they can produce fertile offspring isn't a hard, true definition. We can see it in ourselves. We all possess a small amount between 1 to 3% something of Neanderthal genes, which suggests that we all have some Neanderthal ancestors. Now, Homo neanderthalis is a different species than our own, Homo sapiens. But the fact that we're all Homo sapiens with some Neanderthal genes suggests that even though they were two different species, that they successfully interbred and they produce viable offspring, and because we're the descendants of that viable offspring, right? So even though that's the classical definition, it's not always fast and true. Some species that, if they are similar enough, they can interbreed and have viable offspring. So if we look at the classification, we can see that the more of these hierarchical levels that two organisms have in common, the more features they have in common, and thus the more recent their common ancestor, and the more closely they're related. So we can compare our species, Homo sapiens, to polar bears, blue jays, and crocodiles. We're all in the same kingdom, Animalia, which means we all have evolved from a common ancestral animal. We're all in the same phylum, Chordata. We all have spinal cords. We're all in the same subphylum, vertebrates. So we all have evolved from some ancestral species of vertebrate. But that's where they diverge, right? We can see that we're in a different class than the blue jay and reptiles. So from that ancestral vertebrate, our evolutionary lineage splits. So we have evolved from a different branch of vertebrates than the blue jay and the crocodile do, because we're mammals and they're not. Then if you look at us and the polar bear, so we're more closely related to each other than either of us are to the blue jay or the crocodile, because we both evolved from some ancestral mammal. But from there, our evolutionary lineage splits. So because we're from different orders. We're from the order of primates, where they're from the order of carnivores. So that means that our ancestors diverged. Some ancestral mammal diverged. And then, so because we're the same order as polar bears, we're more closely related. Okay. Where if you compare us to another organism, say even a lemur, we'd be more closely related to a lemur than we would a polar bear, because a polar lemur is also a primate. So would have a more recent common ancestor with a lemur. Then if you look at a chimpanzee, we'd be even more closer to a chimpanzee because we share the same family, Hominidae. No, I mistake. We don't have the same family, different family. But it compares to another species of human, like Neanderthals, or had the same genus, Homo. So these classifications, these hierarchical level classifications, are basically just these nested patterns of similarities. So the Linnaeus, or natural systems classification, gives us information about the biological world, but it doesn't always reflect evolutionary relationships. And so we have to map these out using what are called cladograms or cladograms. They allow us to group organisms with similar characteristics and to better determine evolutionary relationships. Okay, so for example, if we look at this cladogram, each stem, okay, so here's a stem or base or root, whatever you want to call it, it represents some feature or a trait that every organism that comes from that branch or stem possesses. You can see these boxes, and so with how they're representing it is each stem kind of enters a box. So this stem enters this box, and this box represents animals with a skull. So this is a skull. So everything that stems from here has a skull. So hagfish, lampreys, cartilaginous fish, ray fin fish, lobefin fish, lungfishes, amphibians, and amniotes. Where this stem is all organisms with a backbone and a skull, right? It has a skull because it stemmed from here. This is a backbone. So these organisms don't have backbones, but all these organisms that come from this do have backbones. So these all have backbones. So now lampreys, cartilaginous fish, ray fin fish. So what this means is that all these organisms are more closely related to each other than they are to hagfish because they share this common ancestor, one that has a backbone. All right. So now we see, we see this branch. This is all animals that have a backbone and skull, but also have a swim bladder or lungs. Okay, so that includes ray fin fishes, lobefin fishes, lungfishes, amphibians, and amniotes. Where this branch is all organisms that have a skull, a backbone, swim bladder, lungs, and now also have 4 limbs. So that includes amphibians and amniotes. And then this branch is amniotes. So that's all organisms with membranes found around their legs, eggs, 4 limbs, a swim bladder, lungs, and backbone and skull. So amniotes include reptiles, birds, and mammals. So the amniote refers to the amniotic sac. So as we'll learn when we talk about Paleozoic vertebrates, an evolutionary leap was the development of the amniotic sac, which allowed an egg to be laid outside of water. What it is a watertight membrane that prevents the contents of the egg from desiccating, which means drying out, which organisms, vertebrates, did not have to worry about prior to that, fish and amphibians, because they lay their eggs in or near water. Where if you want to lay your eggs outside of water, you have to prevent them from drying out, thus you need a watertight sac, amniotic sac. So if you were to ever peel a hard-boiled egg and get that little thin film underneath the shell, that's the amniotic sac, right? And yes, humans are amniotes too. Ever hear, a woman refers, a woman is pregnant and her water breaks. Well, that water is the amniotic fluid. It's the fluid that is inside of the amniotic sac. And so that amniotic sac is the same sac that surrounds the eggs of reptiles and birds, right? We all inherited it from the ancestral amniote, which is a reptile. And some mammals lay eggs too, and they have an amniotic sac around their eggs. So the only exception, there's a little asterisk there, is snakes. They're on 4 limbs, but they're grouped with those because they've lost their limbs. Just like marine mammals, right? Whales don't have 4 limbs. Okay, they've lost their limbs, but their ancestors did. So this classification allows us to put animals, organisms, not just or any animal into these nested patterns and create these cladograms that show evolutionary relationships. So these stems or bases basically represent common ancestors. And so we're more closely related to amphibians because we share this common ancestor that's in the ancestral animal with 4 limbs than we are with lungfish, lobe-finned fish, or raid-finned fishes, because this is our most recent common ancestor with them. And we're most distantly related to hagfish because we have to go all the way back here to find our common ancestor. So mammals are warm-blooded and have hair, fur, and mammary glands, right? And at the genus level, organisms share most characteristics, but very specific. It's only at the species level that they can, in general, interbreed. So now we're looking at biological evidence of evolution. And so much of the evidence that supports the theory of evolution comes from classification, embryology, genetics, biochemistry, molecular biology, and present-day small-scale evolution, like the bacteria I was talking about. I mentioned embryology when I was talking about whales. So some of the most compelling evidence for evolution is just in simple anatomy. Right? Where we looked at the forelimbs of these vertebrates as an example of divergent evolution. And so these are examples of what are called, what are referred to as homologous structures. Homologous structures, which are structures, okay, that have the same basic blueprint, but have been modified, okay? So the forelimbs of humans, whales, dogs, and birds are superficially dissimilar, right? They're different, but only in a superficial way. They have the same bones articulated in the same manner, right? Just those bones have different proportions and maybe a different number of digits. But yet they are all made up of the same bones and the same arrangement. And so the reason why is because humans, horses, cats, bats, birds, and whales all inherited this structure from the reptile. So the reptile, and it inherited the structure from the amphibian, right? So all of these organisms, all of these vertebrates inherited this structure from the amphibian, and they've all modified it, right, in different ways. So that's homologous structure. So I like to think of a homologous structure as like a vacuum, right? A vacuum is a tool where it uses negative pressure to suck in air to clean, right? But you can have multiple different types of vacuums, right? You can have little handheld vacuums, big shop vacs. You can have all different types of vacuums. And so they're modified for different purposes. They clean different things, right? But in the end, they're all vacuums that operate on the same basic principle, right? They also have the same components that work in the same way to generate that negative pressure to create the suction. But, it's just that, some parts are bigger and the proportions are different to serve superficially dissimilar purposes, but fundamentally they're all vacuum cleaners, right? So that's an example of homologous structures. So we see the reptile, we see, these bones are highlighted, the humerus, the ulnar and radius, the wrist bones, the hand bones, and the digits. And we see those same exact bones articulated in the same way, same arrangement, just modified. They have different proportions. For example, in the whale, the hand bones and digits are much longer compared to the humerus and forearm bones. Same thing with the bat. A horse has lost digits, and so forth. So they're just, modified. Those homologous structures. Another example, so that's homologous structures are examples of divergent evolution. Analogous structures are structures that are evidence of convergent evolution. So analogous structures, they do not descend from a common ancestor. They're structures that do not descend from a common ancestor. common ancestor, like the forelimb of vertebrates. Okay, they're structures that are similar in that they serve the same purpose, but they're structurally and developmentally different. So they do the same thing, but they do it differently. That's analogous. So that's what analogy is, right? Analogy makes the same point, but they're different things that that are related to each other. Make the same point. So an example of analogous structure is a wing, right? You have the wing of a bird, the wing of a bat, and the wing of a fly. So the wing of a bird is produced by having bones and having feathers grow out of those bones. Or the wing of a bat is by having bones, forelimb, and having skin stretched in between the digits and the body of the bat. Or the wing of a fly is made completely different. It doesn't even have bones in its wing. So they all do the same thing, they fly, but they've come about this ability to fly and through different evolutionary paths. Right? You can use the example of the flipper of a dolphin and the fin of a fish, right? They serve the same purpose. Actually, it's not a flipper, it's a paddle. A paddle of a dolphin, right? The flipper of a penguin and the fin of a fish. So the penguin, its flipper, it is a repurposed wing, right? Because it was a bird. A fin of a fish, well, that's the fin of a fish, and the paddle of a dolphin, that was a repurposed forelimb, right? That was used to walk on land. So they're all serve the same purpose, but they came to that purpose through different evolutionary means. Okay. So an example of analogous patterns you can think of. I like to use tools because tools are designed to serve a purpose, and I like it because in engineering and design is a lot like evolution, right? Where you have success, which is to achieve the job that you want the tool to do. You design a tool, you test it, you find out what works, what doesn't work. You scrap what doesn't work, you keep what works, and then you keep on testing and modifying, making the tool better and better and better to more efficiently do the job. So, for example, if you have like if you need to turn a screw, right? You can use a screwdriver, or you can use a wrench, or you can use a ratchet, depending on what type, the height of the screw. But different tools can do the same job. They do it differently, right? But they still do the same job. Those are analogous structures. Another piece of biological evidence are vestigial structures. So vestigial structures are the remnants of structures in an organism that were fully functional in that organism's ancestors, but not so much in that organism itself. An example would be the dew claw in dogs. So dogs, on their forelimbs, they have a claw on the backside of their forelimb. So dogs' ancestors used to climb trees, and that dew claw would help them descend out of a tree. There are just a couple species of dogs that still do climb trees. The wisdom teeth in humans are a vestigial structure. So before we, had stone tools in which we were able to manipulate and process our food, and had mastery of fires that we can cook and augment our food, we weren't processing our food with our hands, and so most of the processing of the food had to be done with our teeth, and so our teeth incurred a lot more wear and tear. And so what happened is after a certain number of years of chewing, your teeth would wear down, so you would need an additional set like some reinforcements that would grow in later for chewing, and that would be your wisdom teeth. But because we evolved the ability to use tools and manipulate and process our food outside of our mouth, we don't need those extra set of teeth. And also, we don't need as strong of jaws. And remember, I said the stronger you need to process that food, you gotta chew it, right? Chew it, chew it, chew it. It's not cooked. It's not, not processed. And so the stronger the muscles, the stronger the bones. So we had larger jaws. Those larger jaws could fit those extra teeth. Where now humans have a smaller lower jaw because they don't have as strong of jaws, because they process their food more with their hands before putting it in their mouth. And some people, their wisdom teeth can't even fit in their lower jaw. And so people are born with no wisdom teeth. People are born with one wisdom tooth, 2, 3, or all 4. We often have to get them removed because they get impacted and we have problems, right? And that's an example of how humans have now kind of risen above natural selection, where if we didn't have the ability to go to an oral surgeon and have those wisdom teeth extracted, then people that had wisdom teeth that got impacted, they might experience complications, get an infection, and if we didn't have antibiotics, that infection would kill you and you'd die. So, you wouldn't have kids. You wouldn't pass on the genes to have those wisdom teeth, right? But, they're still lingering around because we can overcome that. Other vestigial structures like the pelvis in the whale we saw, other ones in humans, tailbone, right? When's the last time you used your tailbone? Right? You never use your tailbone. What is your tailbone? It's, a couple extra vertebrae that stick out past your sacrum, and all those are the last remnants of the tail that our ancestors had. Now, looking at embryology, all of us had a tail when we were a developing fetus in our mother's womb. But at some point in our development, a gene kicked on that said, oh, that tail's going to disappear, and it dissolved away. For some people, very few people, that gene doesn't fully express itself, and not all of the tail dissolves. And so some people are born with a tail, a little tiny tail. So the tailbone is another example of a vestigial structure in humans. So there's the hip bones of whales. Fully functional in Pakicetus, right? It's terrestrial ancestor, but those hip bones serve absolutely no purpose in the whale, just to hold over from a descendant, from an ancestor, sorry. Now we're looking at missing link fossils. Here we go, with what we started with. What is this? Is it a reptile or is it a bird? I don't know. It's hard to tell just by looking at it. So this fossil is a very famous fossil. This is Archaeopteryx, which its name in Greek means ancient wing. So this is, at the time it was found, it was the oldest known organism to find with feathered wings. Right, and you could see the imprint of its wing. It's found in limestone, so it must have died, over a body of water, fell into the water, sunk to the bottom, and was buried in this calcareous ooze and lithified in the limestone. You can see how it has this tail and these feathers coming out of its. My laser pointer. It has this tail and these imprints of feathers coming out of its tail, and its forelimbs, and it has fingers. Right, it has multiple digits and then feathers coming off its forelimb. It has a neck like a bird. It doesn't have a beak. It has a snout like a reptile. Right, so it has these features. Has these reptilian features, but also has these bird features. Reptilian features, bird features. So, we think like, oh, reptiles with feathers, if it has the feathers, it must be a bird, right? Because only birds have feathers. But more fossil evidence suggests that maybe that's not the case. Maybe birds are not the ones that evolved feathers. Maybe birds are just reptiles that began to use their feathers in a specific way. So this is a velociraptor, which a lot of you might be familiar with from the Jurassic Park franchise, even though the velociraptors portrayed in Jurassic Park were factually inaccurate. Velociraptors were much smaller, and as you can see, they were likely feathered, unlike in the movie. And so this is a close relative to the velociraptor. Okay, you can see its fossilized skeleton there. If you look up close, you can see feather quills. So this dinosaur had feathers. It was feathered. Now, we don't see the long flight feathers that birds have on their wings, their forelimbs, but we see these little tiny quill feathers that are what we call downy feathers. I mean, there were some longer feathers that weren't downy feathers, but none of the really long flight feathers. A lot of downy feathers. And so here is, here is the forelimb of a turkey. And you can see where the quills of the feather attach to the bone, there are these things called quill knobs. And here's the forelimb of a velociraptor. And if you look under a microscope, you can see quill knobs. So they're much smaller because the quills were much smaller, so much smaller feathers, but nonetheless, there were feathers protruding from the forelimb of the velociraptor. And so this is likely what a velociraptor really looked like. I think at the time that Jurassic Park was produced or made, they had a good idea that a lot of theropod dinosaurs, which a velociraptor is, were feathered, but just the idea of a fluffy, like feathery dinosaur was a little less dramatic than a cold, like a scaly one, right? So this is an illustration of a velociraptor attacking a protoceratops. A ceratopsian, a different type of dinosaur. Now this is a video. It's actually a faculty member from, I believe, Brown University, and just talks about evolution. It basically, what he says is that, I mentioned earlier that evolution is sometimes a hot topic because evolution does provide one part of the answer to the part of a partial answer to the question of where we come from. Now, people derive. That's a question that people have wondered throughout our entire existence. Where do we come from? Us humans, Homo sapiens, where do we come from? Now we have answers to that questions that come from philosophy, from theology, and from science, right? And I have to say that no one area of thought of those three is more or less valid than the other. Now, some thoughts might be just out of this kind of bonkers, like we were dropped off here by spaceships. That's possible, right? We don't know, but it seems very unlikely, right? So there are unlikely ones, but the thing is, no one explanation is more valid than the other. And in fact, the more we learn through science, the more that the explanations for human origins from these different schools of thought, these different areas of thought, philosophy and theology, religion, the more they begin to agree with each other. And so there's this whole idea of mutual exclusivity between these different realms of thought, say like religion and science. But that's a fallacy. That's not necessary. For example, the Catholic Church says that evolution is a completely viable scientific theory, right? And because it's you can't deny that the data, the scientific evidence suggests that, you know, we evolved from other species of primates, that evolved from other species of primates, which evolved from other mammals, which were other vertebrates, right? So, you know, it is the science of it, but so they don't need to be mutually exclusive. In fact, my personal belief is that it is a sign of provincialness or closed-mindedness, where we say that only one answer can be correct, right? Because in the end, you know, our theology isn't perfect, our philosophy isn't perfect, and our science isn't perfect. You know, and those are all three different lenses or pathways at which we try to come to answers to questions like this, and they're imperfect. And so the idea that we could get a perfect answer from them is just incorrect. You know, it just everyone keep in mind that science is a human construct. It's a logical process of observations, making observations and experimenting with our environment to come to conclusions about how the world around us works. But nonetheless, it is a human construct. It is something we invented. And the last time I checked, humans have never invented anything that is perfect, that works perfectly. Science is a self-correcting process if done correctly, which is beneficial. But to say that the scientific process will be able to answer all questions in the universe, I think is a bit of a stretch, right? First of all, we don't even know if our minds can comprehend everything there is to comprehend, because we are limited to the cognitive ability of our brain, which the cognitive ability of your brain is in part a product of our evolution, correct? So you know, I think it's a real unfortunate situation where people say, you know, they can't coexist, because I think the sign of a truly intelligent person is one that acknowledges that to come to real answers, it takes multiple different approaches thinking about answers to these questions, and that there's no one correct path to an answer, even in science, right? There's no, you know, there's no one set way to answer a scientific question. You can get to the same answer multiple ways. Often, that's the most robust way to get an answer, is through multiple different approaches. You know for sure that is the correct answer if you came to that conclusion through multiple paths. So that's just what I want to add here. And this gentleman, he speaks to similar to that same line of thought as I just talked about. So thank you very much for listening.